Mediators between Ethiopia's federal government and authorities in the Tigray region are stepping up efforts to enforce a truce as relations between the two sides inch closer toward normality. The November 2nd ceasefire stopped a two-year conflict that killed tens of thousands and displaced millions in the Horn of African country, but implementation of parts of the deal has been slower than hoped for. To have a look at some of the biggest stories across the continent, we're joined now by Africa analyst Izak Khomo. Tate Khomo, a very good evening to you. Perhaps let's just start with that peace agreement, the events in the Horn of Africa, particularly the conflict in Ethiopia.
Well, what can I say about the conflict in Ethiopia? Well, if you look at this year, what happened with the conflict in Ethiopia, that conflict was resolved. And that was through the mediation of the AU, which actually had the Nigerian ex-president and also South Africa and Kenya involved. Now, what has happened was that the mediation was achieved, and the two warring parties, as the Tigray Liberation Front and the Ethiopian government, have agreed to resolve issues politically. And in the agreement, the Tigray army had to be disbanded. Basically, this was actually a capitulation of the Tigray forces, and they reverting to a political solution rather than a military solution, which is an option that basically what people do not understand, it was the Tigrayans who went for a military option, trying to solve a thing which had deadlocked politically, militarily.
Now, speaking of a conflict, we saw various coups and some coup attempts on the continent, but most particularly in Burkina Faso and Guinea-Bissau. Some, in fact, started speaking about it as the year of coups on the continent. Please expand a little bit on the events thereof and how they've impacted on democracy in Africa.
Well, I want to talk about democracy first. Let's talk about the coups that have been mentioned. Look at the coup in Guinea-Bissau. Guinea-Bissau basically is a country that has been frustrated and it has been inundated by coups for a long time. But what happened in Guinea-Bissau, it was an attempted coup. It was not actually a coup that was successful, it was an attempted coup, which actually failed. And that coup, it wanted to overthrow a democratically elected government. It failed, not through military action, but just through the people themselves coming up and the coup leaders not getting any support. These were low-level officers. Now, basically, after that, we find that there was an attempted coup in Sao Tome and Principe, which never went far. And so, therefore, we can say that on the average, the African continent had been quiet as far as coups are concerned. There was only one coup which took place in Burkina Faso. The elected president there was overthrown by the army. President Kautaura was overthrown by Dabinda, who later got overthrown by Lieutenant Colonel Ibrahim Traore. Now, a very interesting thing with the coups in Burkina Faso and also in the neighboring country of Mali is this, that the military there, they actually overthrew elected governments, if you want to say, but elected but very unpopular governments. This coming after a lot of mass actions. For the first time, you find that there are coups which have been supported by the masses. In Burkina Faso, before the coups took place, there were heavy demonstrations against the elected government and against the presence of French troops. And it was after that that the military came in to overthrow the government. But there again, you find that in the case of Burkina Faso, a second coup took place. This coup took place after the then military leader. He had invited the former ruler of Burkina Faso, who had come to Burkina Faso on the invitation of the military government. Yet you could find that that particular person, he had a sentence against him for overthrowing Sankara, Thomas Sankara. Now, that was an issue which actually angered the people, and it actually drove Colonel Ibrahim Traore to overthrowing the then military leader. So you find that the coups in Africa, which took place in Burkina Faso, they had the support of the civil organizations. And that's a new issue that's coming up in the African continent.
I think that it would be a natural segue at this point to talk about security, not only in West Africa, the Sahel region, but how it's also impacted on international relations.
Well, security when it comes to international relations, basically you're looking at issues of former French countries. Again, we are looking at issues of countries like you could say Central African Republic. You could look at issues like Mali, and also issues of Burkina Faso, and also the neighboring country of Guinea. But if you take two countries, namely Mali and Central African Republic, you find that these two countries, in the case of, okay, let's take the case of Central African Republic, they've got a democratically elected government. But this elected government actually invited the Russians, officially invited the Russians to come and assist them in actually training the army so they could actually face insurrections, or insurrectors who would actually control over 50% of the country. Now, this issue did not go well with the Western countries who accused the Russians or accused the Wagner mercenaries of coming and interfering in African politics or African sphere, claiming that those were areas which were basically under Western influence. And that has been going on with the Western accusation. The same thing has happened in Mali, where we find that in Mali, the military government, which is there, they actually invited the Russians to come and assist them in actually combating the insurrection, which is being sponsored by Islamist jihadists. And that has actually had a backlash as far as the Western countries are concerned. And in the case of Mali, Mali officially requested the French to withdraw from peacekeeping or efforts in fighting insurrections in the country. In Burkina Faso, just a minute, in Central African Republic, the French are actually packing up right now and they're moving out.
So we can't talk about security and instability without reflecting on the threat of militant insurgency in Southern Africa, the instability that has been caused partly by what is happening in Mozambique.
Yeah, now that's another insurgency which has actually come up. That's in the insurgency in the Cabo Delgado area, that's in northern Mozambique. Now, that insurgency, it's been sponsored or fostered by ISIS-related group. And that actually saw the Mozambican government seeking assistance from SADC countries, but also getting assistance from Rwanda. Now that issue is actually an issue which the SADC countries have taken very seriously, especially a country like Tanzania, where it's said that most of the jihadists in northern Mozambique, they are actually Tanzanians. And the Tanzanian government has got an interest in actually suppressing that insurgency. Again, you find that this insurgency has got there's international interest in that insurgency, mainly from France. It should be known that northern Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, is a site of huge offshore gas strikes. And these gas strikes, they rank amongst the top 10 in the world. And the French company Total is in an advanced stage of actually developing these reserves, whereby they've got an onshore gasification plant. But just before the gasification plant was commissioned, that's when the insurgency took place. Now there are well-supported reports saying that basically the Rwandans are in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. They are there doing the work for France. You should remember that Rwanda and France, they've got a very close relationship now, working relationship, and they are the proxies of the French forces there. And again, it's been said that SADC agreed to send a mission in Mozambique, this after Macron having a visit to South Africa, whereby there's an agreement between France and the South African government to actually suppress the insurrections in Mozambique. This simply because with the coming on stream of the Mozambican gas, some of the gas will be taken to the beleaguered Mossel Bay plant for the production of liquid fuel. So that is the agreement that they say has taken place behind closed doors.
We're reflecting earlier on about dialogues and regional leadership. Let's reflect on elections in Africa now in the past year, but particularly focusing on Somalia and Kenya.
Well, I think I'll take Kenya first. That's the recent elections which took place, which pitted the President Ruto against Odinga, Raila Odinga. People expected that Odinga, who had the support of the then President Uhuru Kenyatta, to win the elections fairly. But to everybody's support, Ruto actually won the elections. But then there were a lot of controversy over the results of the elections, to a point that they took the case to the courts, and the courts eventually came up, which was divided. The court itself would say that it was divided. But however, the court came with the decision of saying that the elections were fair and square, and Ruto had officially won the elections. In fact, the body that was divided, it was the Electoral Commission of Kenya. That was the body that was divided. But then the courts came in favor of the results and declared Ruto as being a democratically and legally elected leader of Kenya. And that has gone well. The Kenyans have accepted it, and Kenya is moving forward. Now, coming to Somalia, Somalia eventually had the elections, but these were not open elections. These were elections whereby leaders are chosen through elective bodies, which consist of tribal leaders, regional leaders, clan leaders. And these are the ones who choose the parliament, and that parliament are the parliamentarians are the ones who come to basically choose a president, which basically is an appointment or a selection of a president. And in that space, in that process, there were a lot of upheavals, whereby the former president, Farmajo, he was hesitant and he tried to manipulate the process. But eventually that process went through and it saw Somalia getting a new president. That's President Sheikh Mohammed. The power basically has moved from Farmajo, who was a Darat, to Sheikh Mohammed, who is Hawiya. And these are the two major clans that are actually in conflict. And people are just hoping that this conflict does not lead to an open warfare.
Just a quick and final one. The AU's theme was on food systems and security. So famine in Africa, particularly in East Africa, the Horn of Africa, has also been a subject of much discussion, but that also doesn't preclude some of the southern African areas. Can we just talk about the prospects, particularly given the fact that the war in Ukraine has not only impacted on global value chains, but the aid that was meant for Africa that is now being diverted to that end of the global corner?
Well, I don't know how I should tackle that, but basically, famine in Africa is actually hit the Horn of Africa, East Africa and the Horn of Africa, very brutally. When I say the Horn of Africa, I'm referring to countries like Ethiopia, and especially the region of Tigray, war-torn region of Tigray. And again, it has hit Somalia. And again, it has also hit Kenya. Now, Tigray had a lot of problems due to the war, and food could not actually flow to the war areas. The international community actually accused the Ethiopians of stopping aid from getting to Tigray. But basically the Ethiopians came back and said that they could not send aid there simply because the initial aid that was sent there, that aid never got to the people. It actually went to the Tigray army. And the trucks, over 100 trucks which were sent there to take that aid, they never came back. They were commandeered by the Tigray Liberation Front and used to transport ammunition and people, and that's the truth. But again, the Ethiopian government said that most of the fighting that took place, did not take place in Tigray. Most of the fighting took place in Amhara and the other neighboring region of Afar, whereby the Ethiopian government was fighting was on the back foot, so they could not actually affect the famine which was taking place in Tigray. But all the same, now that peace has been restored, I think famine relief is flowing there. But coming to places like Somalia, Somalia is actually suffering seriously from famine. This is due to a drought. And the area that's really suffering from drought, it is the southern area of Somalia, area which really it's the breadbasket of Somalia. That's where food for Somalia is being produced. And the government has not declared an emergency, and that's what people are actually sort of criticizing the government for. And that has got to actually be looked into much more seriously. But another thing is the fact that food to Africa, basically most of the Arab countries, and not only Arab countries, but also the Sahelan countries, one of the staple, it is actually bread, wheat. And wheat was coming mostly from Ukraine and the Soviet Union. But the supply of wheat has actually been held back due to the war. And that actually produced a problem, not only in the famine-stricken areas, but also in North Africa. But now, sorry, let me just finish. But now we find that famine relief, which used to come from international organization, has actually been taken to Ukraine, a thing which has actually saddened a lot of Africans and people of the AU.
Izak Khomo, thank you very much. Africa Affairs Specialist, Analyst, Izak Khomo, just taking us through some of the big stories of the year on the continent. Of course, that's a great springboard to look at what have been some of the major stories making headlines across the world.